Hello, my dear patrons, and welcome to January's Patreon tutorial. Thank you all so much for pledging $10 or more this month and for voting on the poll. And today's topic is going to be this hair tutorial on how to paint hair with oils. And if you want, you can pause the screen right now and look over the materials I used for this piece. And I'm just going to move on real quick and dive into the tutorial. Like with painting any other features, I started off the hair section of this piece with a quick underpainting sketch. I used a mixture of Torrid Gray, Black, and Prussian Blue to make a dark grayish color with like a bluish undertone. And this is just to help establish where everything should go, as well as define some of the main basic shapes of the hair. And even though this is an oil painting tutorial, I think this general rule of thumb when it comes to rendering hair can apply across all mediums, even drawing and dry mediums and wet mediums such as oil paint. But instead of trying to see hair as hundreds of thousands of individual strands, try to approach it from a section by section method. So imagine, for those of you out there who have curled your hair or have seen hair being curled, you don't try to curl each strand, nor do you try to curl half of the hair at once or the entire head at once. You break it off into little 1-inch sections and tackle each section at once. And I think painting hair has a lot of the same philosophy. If you try to render each individual strand, you'll end up being way too overwhelmed and the hair will look messy and it won't have any recognizable shapes or waves. And if you try to oversimplify it by treating it as too much of like a solid giant clump, the hair won't look natural and flowing enough. So you want to find a good medium point, and for me that's maybe imagining painting chunks of hair that are maybe 1 to 2 inches wide. And of course later on, as you render details, you can start incorporating individual strands to give the hair more life and more character. But when it comes time to building up the midtones and the shadows like I'm doing now and establishing the main shapes, I like to work in small bunches. My technique for depositing color and for brush strokes is fairly simple. With hair, I like to deposit a giant clump of dense color first and then use the brush to kind of smear and smudge the color around. If I'm applying a dark shadow color or a really bright highlight color, I like to make sure that I don't over smudge, and I like to keep at least the point where I deposited the color the most opaque and the most dense so that the color can stand out. One thing I found that I always used to make mistakes on is whenever I smudged or smeared, I would get way too excited and overdo it, and it would all kind of even out into a midtone instead of staying a really eye-catching dark shadow or really eye-catching highlight. So if you over smear, the color and the intensity of it might disappear. So I would say put a little dab with your brush at the area that you want to be the darkest or want to be the lightest, and then smear only the edges around it instead of smearing the entire thing back and forth. And another technique is to, instead of brushing your brush up and down or side to side over and over again repeatedly, I like to lift my brush up after each stroke. So if I'm smearing to the top, I'll start from the center, stroke up to the top and lift my brush. And the same technique for going down as a downward direction stroke. The reason why you don't want to scrub back and forth is, again, it really mixes the colors up way too much and you lose that intensity. So it just kind of averages out to be a very dull medium color. And hair is just like any other object that has a 3D volume. The way to make it look very lifelike and 3D, like it's popping out of the screen, is to make sure you get the tones correct on the shadows to the highlights. So you want to keep the darkest shadows as dark as possible and the lightest highlights as light as possible. And when you're rendering midtones, of course, it's okay to get like colors in between on the gradient, but really take care of those darkest shadows and lightest highlights. And also the brush you use when you're establishing the basic shapes doesn't really matter. For me, I just prefer to use a filbert that is maybe like medium in size, so I can control the finesse of where the shape is going to go without losing too much detail, but it's also not too small where I have to waste a lot of time covering my canvas or covering my gesso board with color. Next step is to add in some of the little details that make the piece come to life. A quick note, I really recommend waiting for the layers that contain the basic hair shapes to dry first before adding in the little loose strands of hair and tiny details, because oftentimes if you lay the paint on too thick and you try to brush over it with a tiny script liner brush or just any tiny brush with very few hairs, it's going to be really hard for those little strands and strokes to stand out because a wet layer of paint underneath will often smear. So I really recommend letting the layers dry before you dive into adding the final touches and the little details. And then now this step, I'm actually going with a really small liner brush. You can also use a really tiny filbert brush turned to the side. For those of you who don't have liner brushes out there, which is just like a thin brush with very few hairs, you can use either a flat brush, which is like a rectangular tip, or a filbert brush, which is a rounded rectangular tip, and turn it to the side where it's the thinnest and use that to render thin lines. But personally, I definitely prefer a script liner brush for the little details, simply because that's what they're made for and it just works the most effortlessly for me. The little details and the messy hairs to me are my favorite part of rendering hair, and that's where I think the hair really comes to life and stands out. This is my personal preference, but I like to make hair a little bit messy, where it looks like it's just been blown by the wind and there's a lot of loose strands, maybe even tangled up. So you'll see that I'm putting down a lot of these loose strands of hair that are flowing or curving opposite the direction of the main tuft of hair underneath it. So that's the way you make them stand out, is by making them literally jet out of the shape that they're lying on top of. I hope that's making sense. So for example, like if one of the long tufts of hair had an elegant long S curve to it, and I wanted to draw a loose hair that really makes the hair look messy and natural and organic, I would maybe draw an inverted S shape so that that loose strand sticks out. So where the shape is covering the background, the loose strand will not be covering it, and then where the shape makes negative space or exposes the background, the loose strand will fall over that space so that you can really see it. And since my subject has really bright white hair, it stands out really well against the dark background and the dark shadows. So you'll see me painting the loose strands over some of the darker areas of the hair and not making the strands themselves fade into a darker shadow, simply because I imagine the light bouncing off of them in a different way, because they might be lifted off of the head a little bit since they're free-flowing and loose. And so I really wanted to make those stand out. Also, one last thing, if you're painting someone with light colored hair, in my case it's a girl with white, almost silverish hair, the trick is to not use bright white or a really light color or even gray. If you notice, I actually use a lot of blues and pinks in this white-haired girl, because in real life I imagine that the white or really desaturated light colored hair would definitely reflect and absorb the colors of its surroundings. So in my case, I used a bunch of pinks such as Luminous Opera, Radiant Magenta, and different blues like Radiant Turquoise, Prussian Blue, and of course different shades of gray and black, touches of black to make the shadows stand out. But I try to incorporate the colors of the skin tones and the backgrounds into the hair so that it doesn't look too segmented and feels like it really belongs in the environment that it's in. It feels very consistent. All right, and that concludes my how to paint hair tutorial. I hope you guys found this useful. If you have any feedback for me, don't hesitate to leave it in a comment or message me on Patreon. I'd love to make sure that these tutorials are really helpful to you guys. And thank you all so much for supporting me on Patreon. I'm so grateful for your help and encouragement, and I hope to catch you guys next month. Bye!